Mysterious school horror stories. Whispering Willow School had always carried an unspoken weight. It wasn't just the building's gothic spires or the way the forest seemed to inch closer every year. It was something deeper, something you couldn't quite name but felt, like a faint chill that settled in your chest whenever you stepped inside. For years, stories had floated around town. A fire in the West Wing, a teacher who vanished without a trace, whispers of footsteps in empty halls. People talked, but they never stayed on the topic for long, like the words themselves carried some sort of curse. Still, life moved forward. During the day, the school was just that. A school. Laughter, chatter, the shuffle of papers. But when the sun set, that's when the stories started to feel real. Anaya Monroe, no, not Anaya, Brooke Monroe, wasn't afraid of ghost stories. At least that's what she told herself. She was practical, determined, and fiercely independent. As editor of the school paper, she was used to staying late, especially when deadlines loomed. That evening was no different. The library was quiet, almost too quiet, as Brooke typed the final sentences of an article. Her fingers hovered over the keys, her focus broken by the soft hum of the lights overhead. She glanced at the clock. 7:30 p.m. She sighed, leaning back in her chair. Almost done, she whispered to herself, but as she stretched, a sound reached her ears. Software subtle, like footsteps. Her heart skipped. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she scanned the room. "Hello?" she called, her voice thin in the stillness. Nothing. She let out a nervous laugh. "Get it together, Brooke. It's probably just the janitor." She returned to her work, determined to shake off the unease. But then, the sound came again. This time it was louder, closer. Brooke's stomach twisted. She pushed back her chair and stood, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "Is someone there?" she said, her voice firmer now. Silence. But it wasn't just silence. It was heavy, suffocating. The kind that made the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. Brooke's eyes darted to the bookshelves. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the floor, their shapes shifting as if they had lives of their own. Then she saw it. A flicker of movement at the far end of the room. Her breath hitched. Her feet felt rooted to the spot, but she forced herself to step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. As she rounded the corner of the shelves, her gaze fell on a book lying open on the floor. It hadn't been there before. She was sure of it. Slowly, she crouched down. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the book. The pages were blank, except for a single line scrawled in dark red ink. "Leave before it finds you." Brooke's blood ran cold. "What the?" she whispered, dropping the book as if it burned her. The air grew icy, and the hum of the lights turned into a low, vibrating buzz. She stumbled back, her chest tightening with panic. "Okay, nope, I'm done," she muttered, spinning on her heel. She bolted for the door, her footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. But when she reached the door, it wouldn't budge. No, she whispered, yanking at the handle. "Come on." Her voice cracked and tears pricked at her eyes. She pounded on the door, her desperation growing. "Help! Somebody, please!" Behind her, the temperature dropped even more. The shadows moved, stretching, twisting, crawling up the walls. Brooke turned, her breath hitching in her throat. At the far end of the library stood a figure. Tall, dark, inhuman. It didn't have a face, just a void where one should have been. The figure tilted its head as if studying her. Brooke's legs refused to move. Her fear was a living, breathing thing, pinning her in place. The figure took a step forward, then another. The air thickened, pressing down on her like a weight. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. In a last, desperate attempt, Brooke grabbed a book from the nearest shelf and hurled it at the figure. It passed right through. The shadow didn't stop. Brooke backed up until her back hit the door. Tears streamed down her face as she gasped for air. "Please," she whispered, "please, leave me alone. The figure stopped. Its shadowy arm extended toward her, and Brooke felt an icy chill seep into her chest. Her vision blurred, and the world tilted around her. And then, it was gone. The lights flickered back to life, and the heavy silence lifted. The door behind her creaked open. Brooke didn't think, she ran. She didn't stop until she was outside, the cold night air biting her cheeks. She collapsed onto the grass, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The school loomed behind her, its windows glowing faintly in the darkness. She wasn't alone. The shadow was still there, watching. And Brooke knew, deep in her bones, that it wasn't over. Not yet. This is The Mysterious School, horror story number 2. Ravenswood School stood tall at the edge of town, its ivy-covered walls looming like silent sentinels over the sleepy streets. By day, it buzzed with the energy of students and the hum of academics. But by night, it became something else. Everyone knew the legend of the vanishing hallway in the East Wing. It wasn't just a story. It was a dare, a whispered challenge. "Walk the hallway after dark," they'd say, eyes glinting with both fear and mischief. "If you're brave enough to come back, that is." Most laughed it off. Who believed in haunted hallways? But not Sienna. Sienna wasn't like the others. A senior transfer with a passion for unraveling mysteries, she saw the story as an opportunity, a chance to prove that every tale, no matter how chilling, had an explanation. Besides, she thought with a faint smirk, how scary can a hallway really be? The perfect night arrived on a rainy October evening. The kind of night where shadows danced under dim streetlights, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth. Sienna stayed late at school, under the guise of finishing an article for the school paper. Her real goal? To uncover the truth. When the clock struck 9, and the last janitor's mop had swished across the tiled floors, she made her move. The East Wing loomed ahead, quiet and still. As she stepped inside, the sound of her sneakers echoed unnaturally, each squeak swallowed by the heavy silence. She turned the corner, and there it was, the vanishing hallway. It looked ordinary. Too ordinary. Lockers stretched endlessly on either side. The lights above flickered faintly, casting shadows that seemed to pulse with every step she took. The air was cool. Too cool, as if the hallway existed in its own little pocket of reality. Her chest tightened. "This is fine," she whispered, the sound of her own voice oddly comforting. She clutched her flashlight tighter and snapped a photo. The click of the camera broke the silence, but when she glanced at the screen, her heart stuttered. The image didn't show a straight hallway. Instead, the walls twisted and warped unnaturally, as though the hallway itself was alive. Her throat felt dry. "Okay, just keep moving." Her voice cracked slightly, and she cleared her throat. "No big deal, Sienna. Just a camera glitch." But then she heard it. A whisper. Software, faint. "Sienna." She froze. Every hair on her body stood on end. Her heart thudded against her ribs as she swung her flashlight wildly. "Hello?" she called, her voice quivering. No answer, just more whispers. Low at first, but then louder, overlapping, like a dozen voices trying to speak at once. Each one said her name. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to breathe. "It's not real," she murmured, her words a fragile shield against the creeping terror. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. Up ahead, a door appeared. It hadn't been there a moment ago. She was certain. It was old, wooden, with carvings that seemed to move when she stared too long. Her fingers hovered over the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to run, but she couldn't. "This is what you came for," she reminded herself, forcing her hand to steady. The knob turned with a groan, and the door creaked open, revealing a small, circular room. Inside, photographs lined the walls, hundreds of them. She stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. Each photograph showed a student sitting in a wooden chair, this wooden chair placed in the center of the room. Their faces were frozen in expressions of fear, their eyes wide, pleading. Her stomach churned. "This isn't real," she whispered, though the trembling in her voice betrayed her doubt. She raised her camera to document the scene, but as she snapped the picture, the door slammed shut behind her. The room plunged into darkness. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she spun around, searching for an escape. The photographs began to change. Faces blurred, twisted, their eyes following her. Then the whispers returned, clearer this time. "We see you, Sienna." Her legs gave out, and she fell to her knees, gripping the floor to steady herself. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, this isn't real. This isn't—" Her words were cut off by a cold wind that swept through the room, carrying the whispers with it. She screamed, the sound ripping through the oppressive silence. But then, silence. The door creaked open, and light spilled in. She scrambled to her feet, rushing out of the room and into the hallway. It was normal again, short, familiar. She didn't stop running until she was outside, the rain drenching her hair and clothes. The cold water shocked her back to reality, grounding her in the present. That night, safe in her room, she pulled out her camera and retrieved the memory card. Her fingers shook as she loaded the photos. The first few were normal, images of the hallway and the warped walls, but the last photo wasn't what she'd expected. It wasn't of the room or the photographs. It was of her, sitting in the wooden chair, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. The screen flickered, and words appeared in jagged text. "This isn't over." She slammed the laptop shut, her heart racing. She tried to convince herself it was a dream, a figment of her overactive imagination. But deep down, she knew. The hallway hadn't let her go. It had simply let her leave. For now. This is The Mysterious School, horror story number 3. Blackwood High stood on the outskirts of a forgotten town, its towering brick facade cloaked in thick ivy and shadows. Built in the late 1800s, the school exuded an eerie charm, its grand design tarnished by age and stories of strange happenings. To most, those tales were simply folklore. But for Maeve Nolan, a recent transfer, Blackwood High was about to become the site of a chilling reality. Maeve wasn't one for superstition. Coming from the city, she had little patience for the theatrics of ghost stories. But Blackwood felt different. Something about its cold, damp halls made even her logical mind waver. On her first day, as she wandered through the labyrinth of corridors, she noticed a strange vibration in the walls, a low hum that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was unsettling. At lunch, she joined a group of students who seemed eager to include her in their circle. It didn't take long for the conversation to shift to the school's famous whispering walls. "They're not just stories," Ava, a girl with fiery red hair and dramatic flair, declared with a sly grin. "At night you can hear them. Whispers. My brother swears he saw something move inside the plaster." Maeve laughed, though it was more out of nervousness than amusement. "Yeah, right," she muttered. "That's just the wind." Ryan, a quieter boy with a skeptical smile, interjected. "It's all just the building settling. Trust me, it's nothing." But Ava leaned closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You'll hear it, Maeve. Everyone does. It's impossible not to." That night, Maeve lay in her dorm room, staring up at the ceiling. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building. Then, just as she was about to drift off, she heard it, the faint hum again. She held her breath, listening closely. "Help me." The whisper was barely audible, almost as if it were coming from another world. Maeve's heart skipped a beat. Sitting up, she pressed her ear against the wall. Nothing. It was probably nothing, she told herself, shaking her head. She climbed back into bed, determined to ignore it. But sleep wouldn't come. Not that night. The next day, Maeve found herself unable to focus in class. The whisper kept echoing in her mind, growing louder and more persistent. At lunch, she approached Ava and Ryan, her curiosity finally getting the better of her. "About the walls," she began, her voice hesitant. "Do you really think they Talk? Ava's eyes lit up, her excitement palpable. Knew you'd come around, she exclaimed, practically bouncing in her seat. It's not just me. Ask anyone who's been here long enough. The walls whisper. You'll hear them eventually, I swear. But if you really want to know, you have to come to the library tonight. Midnight. Maeve hesitated, uncertainty tugging at her, but her curiosity won out. Fine, I'll come. That night, Maeve stood outside the library, flashlight in hand, heart pounding in her chest. Ava, Ryan, and another student named Sam were already waiting for her. You actually showed up. Ava grinned, her voice low and excited. I like you already. The library was cold, the air thick with dust and age. The long rows of bookshelves cast dark, looming shadows, and the only sound was the echo of their footsteps as they moved deeper into the room. As they approached the east wing, Maeve felt the air grow heavier, the hum from earlier intensifying. It was impossible to ignore. Do you hear that? She whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Ava nodded, her expression serious now. This is where it's strongest, she said, pointing to a section of the wall. The plaster here looked cracked, almost as if it had been disturbed. Maeve pressed her hand to the wall. It was cool, but there was something else. A strange vibration underneath her fingers, a faint hum, like the building itself was alive. There's something behind here, Sam muttered, his voice a low tremor of fear. Ryan pulled out a small penknife. Let's see what's behind it, he said, his voice steady, though his eyes darted nervously. With a few quick movements, Ryan chipped away at the plaster, revealing a hidden hollow. Inside it, an old leather-bound journal lay untouched, its cover thick with dust. Ava gently pulled it out, her hands trembling as she wiped the grime away to reveal the name etched into the gold leaf. Margaret Hensley. Who's that? Maeve asked, a cold shiver creeping down her spine. No idea, Ava replied, carefully flipping the journal open. But we're about to find out. The journal, they discovered, belonged to a teacher named Margaret Hensley, who had worked at Blackwood High in the 1950s. At first, her entries were ordinary, lessons, student anecdotes, her passion for teaching. But as they read on, the tone shifted. The pages became filled with frantic, confused writing. Margaret wrote about hearing whispers in the halls, books that moved of their own accord, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. In the final, chilling entry, she wrote, I hear them more clearly now. They're trapped, I'm sure of it. I can feel their pain. But I'm going to help them. Tonight, I'll find them. If anyone reads this, please. The entry ended abruptly. The final words cut off, as if someone had torn the page from the journal. What happened to her? Maeve whispered, her throat dry. No one knows, Ava said, her voice shaky, her hands holding the journal with reverence. She just disappeared. Suddenly, the whispering grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. Help us! The voices cried, desperate and pleading. The group froze. Their flashlights trembled in their hands as the voices seemed to swirl around them, impossibly close. What do you want from us? Maeve asked, her voice a mere whisper, heart racing. The whispers fell silent, leaving only one voice, clearer than the others. Find the truth. Maeve swallowed hard, her breath catching in her throat. The walls around them began to vibrate. The floorboards creaked. The room seemed to pulse with something dark, ancient. Without thinking, Maeve grabbed the journal. We have to leave. Now! The group rushed back up the stairs, the floor groaning beneath their feet. As they burst through the library door and into the hallway, the whispers stopped, leaving an eerie, suffocating silence in their wake. What the hell just happened? Ryan asked, his voice trembling as he glanced around nervously. I think, Maeve said, breathing heavily, I think we've uncovered something. Something that's been buried for a long time. Ava nodded, her face pale. I knew there was more to this place than we realized. The group never returned to the hidden room, but the whispers did not fade. They followed Maeve, Ava, Ryan, and Sam, a constant reminder of the darkness that lay hidden beneath the surface of Blackwood High. And every day, as Maeve walked the halls, she couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret and the other voices were still waiting, watching, pleading for someone to uncover the truth.